Imagine you are standing on an open wooden deck, 20 meters long in the middle of the North Sea. The temperature is well below zero. There is no roof above you, no walls around you. The wind cuts at over 60 kilometers per hour, carrying freezing saltwater spray that soaks through every layer of clothing within minutes. The waves are not gentle swells, they are walls of black water, rising and collapsing with enough force to split oak beams. And in the middle of all of this, 30 men need to sleep, not just rest, not just survive. They need to actually sleep deeply enough to recover physical strength, to be able to row the next morning, to function, to live. This should not be possible. Every modern principle of thermal physiology tells us that a human body exposed to those conditions, wet, windswept, without shelter, without insulation from the ground, should lose core temperature within 2 hours. Hypothermia sets in. Cognitive function collapses. The body begins to shut down its extremities to protect the vital organs. And then, quietly, it stops entirely. This is not theory. This is what happens. This is what the cold does. And yet, for nearly 3 centuries, Viking sailors crossed the North Atlantic and the North Sea during autumn and winter voyages, sleeping on open decks and arriving at their destinations alive. Not just some of them. The system worked consistently enough that entire trade networks, raiding expeditions, and colonization efforts depended on it. Greenland was settled. Iceland was populated. The British Isles were reached repeatedly in winter by men sleeping under the open sky. This was not luck. This was not endurance. This was engineering. And to understand how it actually worked, we need to look much more closely than anyone expects. If you find this kind of deep investigation into forgotten systems worth your time, consider subscribing to this channel and let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching from. Because the people who tend to find this content most fascinating come from places that still understand what winter really means. Because the answer to how they slept is not where most people look. Most people, when they try to imagine Viking sailors sleeping at sea, fall into the same mental trap. They picture brute force. They imagine men so hardened by violence and cold that they simply did not feel what ordinary humans feel. The popular image is of warriors who laughed at discomfort, who were built differently, metabolically superior, biologically immune to what would kill anyone else. It is a compelling image. It is also almost entirely wrong. This wasn't mythology. This was physiology. The Vikings were not a different species. Their bodies lost heat at exactly the same rate as any other human body. Their core temperature dropped under the same conditions. They shivered. They suffered frostbite. They died from exposure when the system failed. The sagas themselves record deaths from cold at sea, not as extraordinary events, but as understood risks, the kind of risks that demanded a response. And that response was not to become superhuman. It was to build a system that made the environment manageable for an ordinary human body. Here is where the first and most important misconception collapses. The assumption has always been that Viking ships were primitive, open, unprotected, brutal by design. What that framing misses entirely is that the ship itself was not the only system in operation. The sailors carried their shelter with them. It was not built into the vessel. It was worn, packed, deployed, and managed as a separate engineering solution operating in parallel with the ship's own structure. 2 systems running simultaneously, interdependent in ways that only become visible when you examine the physical evidence closely. They were not surviving the cold. They were managing a thermal environment with tools specifically engineered for that purpose. The central artifact in this system has a name that almost no one outside of Scandinavian historical scholarship recognizes: the Hudfat. The word translates roughly as hide container or skin vessel, but that translation strips away what the object actually was. A Hudfat was a sleeping enclosure, a sealed bag of animal hide, constructed with enough internal volume for 1 or 2 grown men, designed not merely to cover the body, but to trap and retain metabolic heat with a precision that rivals, in principle, the insulation engineering of modern sleeping bag design. But the Hudfat was not a sleeping bag in the simple sense. Its engineering went significantly deeper than that. This was not primitive design. This was a thermal system. To understand why the Hudfat worked, you need to understand one fundamental principle of heat physics. The enemy is not cold itself. The enemy is heat transfer. The human body generates a significant amount of thermal energy continuously, roughly 80 watts at rest, more when shivering. The problem in a cold environment is not the absence of heat. The problem is the rate at which that generated heat escapes into the surrounding environment. Wind accelerates this process dramatically. Moisture accelerates it even further. A wet surface conducts heat away from the body at a rate 25 times faster than dry air. On a Viking ship in a winter storm, both enemies were present simultaneously. Wind stripping thermal energy from the surface, moisture conducting it away from every point of skin contact. The hood fat addressed both mechanisms at the same time. The outer layer of the hood fat was constructed from the thickest available hide, most commonly sealskin or double-layered cowhide, treated with animal fat to create a near-waterproof barrier. This outer shell did something that seems simple, but is thermodynamically critical. It stopped the wind completely. Inside the bag, there was no convective heat loss. The air trapped within the enclosure could actually warm up, but the outer shell alone was not what made the system work. The interior was where the real engineering lived. The inner surface of the hood fat was lined with wool, and not wool in the way we casually understand the material. Viking Age wool was processed differently than modern commercial wool. The lanolin content, the natural oil produced by sheep, was deliberately preserved during preparation. This was not an accident of primitive processing. It was a choice. Lanolin is hydrophobic. It actively repels water at the fiber level. This means that even as condensation formed inside the sleeping enclosure, from the sailor's own breath and body moisture, the wool maintained its insulating structure. Modern synthetic sleeping bag insulation is engineered to do exactly this: maintain loft and thermal resistance even when exposed to moisture. The Viking solution achieved the same functional outcome through a different material pathway, understood through generations of accumulated practical knowledge rather than laboratory testing. This was not a coincidence. This was accumulated engineering intelligence. But the material properties of the hood fat only tell part of the story. The physical configuration in which it was used was equally important. And this is where the system becomes genuinely surprising. A single hood fat was often shared by two men. This arrangement is sometimes described in historical accounts as a matter of necessity, a compromise forced by limited resources. That framing is backwards. Sharing the enclosure was the optimal thermal strategy, not a fallback position. Two human bodies inside a sealed insulated enclosure generate twice the metabolic heat, warming the internal air volume to a functional temperature far more rapidly than a single body could. The system was designed for dual occupancy. The dimensions recorded in archaeological and textual sources confirm this. The standard hood fat was sized for two, not one. The thermal math is straightforward. A single adult male at rest generates approximately 80 watts of heat. Two men generate 160 watts, heating the same enclosed air volume. The time required to bring the internal temperature of the enclosure from ambient, perhaps minus 10 degrees Celsius, to a survivable sleeping temperature of approximately 15 to 18 degrees was dramatically shorter with two occupants. This mattered profoundly on a vessel where the window of calm between wave strikes might be measured in minutes. The sailors did not have the luxury of slowly warming a sleeping enclosure over an hour. The system had to work fast, or it did not work at all. This changes everything about how we understand the decision to share sleeping space. There is another layer to this that the thermal analysis alone does not capture. On an open deck, the position of the body relative to the hull structure was not random. The most experienced sailors oriented the hood fat along the inside of the hull, using the wooden strakes as a windbreak for the lower half of the enclosure. This reduced convective loss even further on the side, most exposed to lateral wind and spray. The ship's own architecture was being used as an element in the thermal management system. The vessel and the sleeping enclosure were not separate solutions. They were integrated components of a single heat retention strategy. This was intentional design, not adaptation, not accident, design. There is a third system operating beneath the first two, and it is the one that most completely changes the way this entire picture is understood. It has nothing to do with the HUD itself. It has nothing to do with material science or the geometry of the hull. It operates at the level of collective human behavior, and it was maintained with the same discipline as any other aspect of ship operation. Viking sailors on winter voyages were managed under a system of watch rotations that served a dual purpose. The primary function was navigation and sail management, obvious and expected. The secondary function is what almost no modern account acknowledges. The rotation system was a thermal survival protocol disguised as a duty roster. Here is how it worked. The crew was divided into watches, typically half the complement at a time. While one watch managed the ship, the other was inside the HUD enclosures. When the watch rotated, the men emerging from active duty were entering sleeping enclosures that had already been warmed by their occupants for the previous hours. They were not starting cold. They were inheriting a pre-warmed thermal environment. This is the moment where the system reveals its true sophistication. Think about what this means. In an environment where warming a sleeping space from ambient temperature to survivable sleeping temperature takes metabolic energy and time, the rotation system effectively eliminated the cold start problem entirely. Every man entering sleep was entering an already conditioned space. The thermal energy generated by the previous occupant was banked, stored in the warmed air and the warmed wool lining, and transferred to the incoming sleeper. This is heat management through behavioral scheduling, a concept that modern building engineers call thermal mass utilization, typically applied to structures, not to human bodies organized in rotating shifts. They weren't just sleeping in shifts. They were running a heat exchange system with their own bodies. The discipline required to maintain this was absolute. Breaking the rotation, staying awake past your watch, failing to enter the enclosure during your designated rest period, did not just exhaust the individual. It disrupted the thermal cycle for the entire crew. A man who failed to pre-warm the enclosure before the next occupant arrived was not just shirking duty, he was degrading the thermal infrastructure of the ship. This is why the sagas describe watch discipline with the same severity as combat discipline. The social enforcement of the rotation was not about hierarchy, it was about survival mechanics. This was not routine. This was a thermodynamic protocol enforced through social structure. If there is a moment in this analysis where you feel the weight of what these men actually understood, not intellectually but practically, in their hands and their decisions, it might be worth pausing here. The people who developed this system over generations, testing it against the North Sea in November, were operating without any of the conceptual frameworks we use to describe what they built. They did not have words for convective heat loss or thermal mass or metabolic wattage. And yet the system they produced maps almost precisely onto the principles that modern cold weather survival engineering uses as its foundation. Leave a comment below. We want to know where in the world you are watching this, and whether the winter where you are gives you even a fraction of what these men managed in. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is the kind of content we build here. Systems beneath the surface. Intelligence hidden in plain sight. Now bring all three systems together and look at what you are actually seeing. The HUD is a sealed thermal enclosure, with wind-blocking outer shell and moisture-resistant insulating interior. Its dual occupancy is not a social arrangement, but a heat generation strategy. Its placement against the hull integrates the ship's own architecture into the thermal management plan. The watch rotation pre-warms every sleeping enclosure before its next occupant arrives, eliminating the cold start problem and creating a continuous cycle of banked thermal energy moving through the crew. None of these elements functions in isolation. Remove any single component and the system degrades rapidly. Remove the rotation and the enclosures go cold. Remove the hull placement and convective loss returns. Remove the wool lining and moisture destroys the insulation. Remove the outer hide layer and wind strips the heat faster than two bodies can produce it. This is what integrated engineering looks like before the word engineering existed. The most important insight in all of this is not technical, it is perceptual. We look at the archaeological record of Viking maritime culture and we see the weapons, the runes, the longships, the carved prows. We construct an image of violence and endurance. What we systematically fail to see is the intellectual infrastructure. the problem-solving apparatus that operated continuously beneath the surface of every voyage. The hood-fat system, the watch rotation, the hull integration, these were not things that happened to work. They were solutions developed through a rigorous, if unwritten, engineering process, tested against the harshest quality control environment on the planet. The North Sea in winter. This wasn't survival instinct. This was systems thinking without a name. And when you understand that, the Viking sailor sleeping in a wave-battered knarr somewhere off the coast of Norway in the year 980 looks entirely different. Not a brute enduring the cold through sheer will. Something far more precise than that. A human being operating inside a carefully engineered thermal system, managed through collective behavioral discipline, built from materials selected for specific physical properties, integrated into the architecture of the vessel, carrying him across one of the most dangerous bodies of water on Earth. He was not sleeping despite the storm. He was sleeping because the system worked. And the system worked because someone generations before him had understood the problem well enough to solve it completely. Without instruments, without laboratories, without anything except the accumulated intelligence of people who could not afford to be wrong.